Hello everyone and welcome to the lecture on AWS Security Token Service, AWS STS. So this lecture will contain all those topics. What is AWS STS? Advantages of STS, actions, assume role with SAML, assume role with web identity, assume root, decode authorization message, get access key info, get caller identity, get federation token, get session token, common scenarios for temporary credentials and service bearer tokens. So what is AWS STS? AWS Security Token Service allows you to grant trusted users access to your AWS resources using temporary security credentials. This provides a secure way to manage who can access your AWS environment. Temporary credentials are designed to be short-lived, ranging from just a few minutes to several hours. Once they expire, they are no longer valid, enhancing security by limiting the window of opportunity for misuse. AWS will not recognize expired credentials for API request. Unlike long-term access keys, temporary security credentials are not permanently stored with users. Instead, they are generated dynamically and provided to the user only when they are requested, adding an extra layer of security. Users can request new temporary security credentials when their current ones are about to expire or even before, as long as the user still holds the necessary permissions. They can maintain continuous access to resources by periodically renewing their credentials. AWS STS temporary credentials have the following advantages over long-term credentials. So first one, you do not have to distribute or embed long-term AWS security credentials within an application. You can provide access to your AWS resources to users without having to define an AWS identity for them. Temporary credentials are the basis for roles and identity federation. The temporary security credentials have a limited lifetime, so you do not have to update them or explicitly revoke them when they are no longer needed. After temporary security credentials expire, they cannot be reused. You can specify how long the credentials are valid up to a maximum limit. So some actions associated with the STS API. So these are assume role with SAML, assume role with web identity, assume root, decode authorization message, get access key info, get caller identity, get federation token and get session token. So first one, assume role. This returns a set of temporary security credentials that you can use to access AWS resources. These temporary credentials consist of an access key ID, a secret access key and a security token. Typically, you use assume role within your account or for cross-account access. The temporary security credentials created by assume role can be used to make API calls to any AWS service with the following exception. You cannot call the AWS STS, get federation token or get session token API operations. Second action is assume role with SAML. This returns a set of temporary security credentials for users who have been authenticated via SAML authentication response. This operation provides a mechanism for tying an enterprise identity store or directory to role-based AWS access without user-specific credentials or configuration. The temporary security credentials written by this operation consist of an access key ID, a secret access key, and a security token. Applications can use these temporary security credentials to sign calls to AWS services. Third one, AWS role with web identity. This returns a set of temporary security credentials for users who have been authenticated in a mobile or web application with a web identity provider. Example providers include the OAuth 2.0 providers, login with Amazon and Facebook, or any OpenID Connect compatible identity providers such as Google or Amazon Cognito. Federated identities. Calling assume role with web identity does not require the use of AWS security credentials. Therefore, you can distribute an application, for example, on mobile devices that request temporary security credentials without including long-term AWS credentials in the application. You also don't need to deploy server-based proxy services that use long-term AWS credentials. Instead, the identity of the caller is validated by using a token from the web identity provider. Fourth one, assume root, and this returns a set of short-term credentials you can use to perform privileged tasks on a member AWS account in your AWS organization. you must use credentials from an AWS organization's management account or a delegated administrator account for IAM to call assume root. You cannot use root user credentials to make this call. Before you can launch a privileged session, you must have centralized root access in your organization. Fifth one, decode authorization message, and this decodes additional information about the authorization status of a request from an encoded message returned in a response to an AWS request. For example, if a user is not authorized to perform an operation that he or she has requested, the service returns a client unauthorized operation response, which is basically an HTTP 403 response. Sixth one is get access key info, and this returns the account identifier for the specified access key ID. Access key consists of two parts: an access key ID. For example, when you create a AWS profile using CLI, you get an access key ID and a secret access key. And when you pass an access key ID to this operation, it returns the ID of the AWS account to which the key belongs. Access key IDs beginning with AKIA are long-term credentials for an IAM user or the AWS account root user. Access key IDs beginning with ASIA are temporary credentials that are created using AWS STS operations. Get caller identity, and this returns details about the IAM user or role whose credentials are used to call the operation. Get federation token, and this returns a set of temporary security credentials, and this consists of an access key ID, a secret access key, and a security token for a user. A typical use is in a proxy application that gets the temporary security credentials on behalf of distributed applications inside a corporate network. You must call the get federation token operation using the long-term security credentials of an IAM user. As a result, this call is appropriate in context where those credentials can be safeguarded, usually in a server-based applications. Although it is possible to call get federation token using the security credentials of an AWS account root user rather than IAM user that you create for the purpose of a proxy application, but most of the time it will be used by the IAM user. Get session token, and this returns a set of temporary credentials for an AWS account or IAM user. The credentials consist of an access key ID, a secret access key, and a security token. Typically, you use get session token if you want to use multi-factor authentication MFA to protect programmatic calls to a specific AWS API operations like Amazon EC2 stop instances. MFA enabled IAM users must call get session token and submit an MFA code that is associated with their MFA device. Using the temporary security credentials that the call returns, IAM users can then make programmatic calls to API operations that require MFA authentication. An incorrect MFA code causes the API to return an access denied error. Finally, we'll just compare and contrast different STS API. So I have only 5 important ones. So first is assume role, and this can be called by IAM user or IAM role. And then we have minimum lifetime, which is 15 minute, and the default is 1 hour. And you can set a maximum also. MFA support is yes. Session policy support is yes. And restrictions cannot call get federation token or get session token. Next one, assume role with SAML. So any user can call, and caller must pass a SAML authentication response that indicates authentication from a known identity provider. And time duration is same. MFA support no, and session policy support is yes. Same restriction for this also. Assume role with web identity. So this can be called by any user. Caller must pass an OIDC compliant JWT token that indicates authentication from a known identity provider. And credential lifetime can be set same 15, 1 hour is default, and some maximum session duration. No MFA support, session policy support yes. Same restriction. Get federation token. So this can be called by IAM user or AWS account root user. For IAM user, default is 12 hour, Maximum you can set up to 36 hours, and the minimum is 15 minutes for root user because it's a privileged operation. Max and default can be 1 hour, and no MFA support, but session policy support is there. And there is a restriction that you cannot call IAM operations using the AWS CLI or AWS API, and this limitation does not apply to console sessions. One more, you cannot call AWS STS operations except get caller identity. Lastly, get session token. So who can call IAM user or AWS account user? For IAM user, max can be 36 hours and default is 12 hours. For root user, again 15, 1, 1. And MFA support for this, yes, and no session policy support. And you cannot call IAM API operations unless MFA information is included with the request. You cannot call AWS STS API operations except assume role or get caller identity. SSO console is not allowed. So common scenarios for temporary credentials. So temporary credentials are useful in scenarios involving identity federation, delegation, cross-account access, and IAM roles within AWS. Identity federation allows managing user identities in external systems, either within your data center or through third-party web providers to access AWS resources. IAM supports two main types of identity federation. One for external systems in your data center and another for external third-party web providers. OpenID Connect, OIDC. So OpenID Connect Federation enables users to sign in to AWS using well-known third-party providers like Google or Facebook, which enhances security by avoiding distribution of long-term AWS credentials. For mobile applications, Amazon Cognito is recommended for managing user identities and authentication, supporting the same identity providers as AWS STS and offering additional features like data synchronization. SAML Federation allows users authenticated within an organization's network to gain AWS access through single sign-on without requiring separate AWS credentials. Custom federation brokers can be implemented to grant AWS access using an organization's existing authentication system. Rules for cross-account access enable users in one AWS account to securely access resources in other AWS accounts within the same organization through delegation. Rules for Amazon EC2 provide temporary credentials to applications running on EC2 instances, which allows them to access AWS resources securely without storing long-term credentials on the instances. Temporary security credentials can be used to access most AWS services. So, and lastly, I'll talk about service bearer tokens. So, AWS services require obtaining an AWS STS service bearer token to gain programmatic access to their resources, emphasizing a permission prerequisite. Certain AWS services employ a protocol that mandates the use of bearer tokens for API requests as opposed to the conventional AWS signature version 4. So this is specific to some format or some kind of a agreed upon protocol, which is AWS signature version 4. When AWS CLI or AWS API operations requires bearer tokens, the AWS service itself initiates a request for a bearer token on the user's behalf, subsequently providing the token for use in subsequent service operations. AWS service bearer tokens encapsulate details from the original principal authentication, potentially influencing permissions and encompassing principal tags, session tags, and session policies. Bearer tokens are identifiable in CloudTrail logs through their access key IDs, which begin with the ABIA prefix, aiding in tracking operations performed using these tokens. AWS Code Artifact is an illustrative service that supports bearer tokens, requiring them for interaction via package managers like NPM, Maven, or pip. So this is one of the example, Code Artifact, where service bearer tokens are used. To obtain a bearer token for AWS code artifact operations, users must invoke the AWS code artifact space, and then you have a operation called get authorization token operation, which returns the necessary token, which is the bearer tokens. As an alternative, the AWS code artifact login command can be used, which performs the same token acquisition operation and additionally automates the configuration of the client. And this is how STS looks like. So it's a global service. So let's say this is you call the global service and you provide the like what action you want to call and some version and the role session name and which role you want to assume. So we are calling assume role, and this will check out the policy, and the policy will attach like what action should be allowed by assuming this role. But behind the scene, it will check whether this role is allowed by this user, and this wants to assume this particular role, right? And how much duration seconds, and any tags that are associated with it, and what is the external ID, what is the source identity, and any auth params. So this will go as, so this is one example. So I talked about 9 different actions. So for different actions, there will be different set of parameters that must be passed. And that's all. Thanks for watching.